All right, thank you everyone for coming to our panel on solving climate change. I was talking about this panel to several people, and they said this is such a bold title. And I feel that this is one that we actually have to do. We actually have to solve climate change. You know, you can be as post-structuralist as you want, as interpretivist of a sociologist as you want to be, and still at the end of the day, there has to be a habitable planet. So we have to do it, and social scientists have to be a key part of it. It's just technological solutions are only going to take you so far. So there has to be some sort of space for framing the question in a way that encourages sociologists to move towards actually solving it. I'm not sure if we're going to solve it in the next hour and a half, but we will do what we can, because we have this incredible panel of sociologists who are focused on climate change from various different ways. And so we decided that we would just go alphabetically, and the panelists will each speak for about 10 minutes. And after that, there will be plenty of time for Q&A. So we start with Josh BASSECHES, who is an assistant professor of public policy at Tulane University.
That's perfect.
All right, great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Monica. It's really great to be here. So today I want to talk to you all about a trade-off that we seem to be making here in the United States when it comes to climate policy making. And just a disclaimer, my research is heavily US focused. So I'm really excited to learn from my co-panelists about how things may be similar or different elsewhere in the globe, obviously with climate change being a global problem. But here in the US, at least, the trade-off we seem to be making is that we're passing some pretty bold policies from an emissions reduction standpoint, particularly targeting electricity sector emissions, given our strategy to electrify everything, including transportation, buildings, etc. But we're doing so without fundamentally altering the structure of our political economy when it comes to electricity, and that's leading to a lot of cost shifting. That is, there are certain short-term costs and financial risks associated with the longer-term energy transition, and those are being shifted away from the corporate actor that is responsible for providing most of us in the US with our electricity and onto everyone else. And everyone else, by the way, does include business actors like commercial and industrial electricity. So we seem to be doing this trade-off, and it's affecting everyone, but the effects are worse for us residential customers who don't have our own lobbyists in DC and state houses. And given the regressive nature of electricity rates, it's really hurting the lower income residential population the most, particularly those who rent their homes rather than own them. So in this presentation, I want to take us through 3 examples of how this is happening, and then I'll conclude with some thoughts on what we might try to do about it. So the first example is the one that I have the deepest knowledge about because it's essentially my dissertation research. So Monica will know it well since she co-chaired my dissertation committee. I looked at 3 US states, California, Massachusetts, and Oregon. There you see Governor Schwarzenegger from California twirling a globe on his finger after passing AB 32, that state's landmark climate law in 2006. And these states have all had passed some pretty aggressive climate policies, both economy-wide greenhouse gas laws and also specific laws targeting electricity emissions called renewable portfolio standards. And there's some variation among them in terms of these laws, but overall, they're by far some of the leading US states on this issue. So the question is, how are they able to overcome the vested corporate interests opposing these policies and take action to reduce emissions where the federal government had long failed? And the answer that I came up with based on what I call policy-focused interview and archival research, and I'm happy to get into more of that in the Q&A in terms of what that is. But basically, these 3 states did what they were able to do because they included in these laws some extraneous, highly technical, and far less headline-grabbing provisions that exploited the highly unusual way we govern electricity in this country through these private corporations called investor-owned utilities, and essentially bought them off in order to gain their political support for these policies by shifting any financial costs or risks that they might imply away from their shareholders and onto the captive electricity customers they serve. So the table you see in the slide is from my research on RPS policies. And it shows a number of these provisions and the policy preferences of different business actors. And you can see here that the investor-owned utilities got what they wanted each and every time over the opposition of other business interests, never mind the general public. Okay, so the second example. So some of you may have heard that the United States passed its first ever federal climate law this past summer, calling it the Inflation Reduction Act. So how did this happen after decades of inaction from the federal government? Well, there's actually, of course, a number of reasons. With something as big as this, it's never just one thing. But we know from media reporting that Joe Manchin was the most proximate reason in terms of finally giving the bill his vote. But stepping back to look at the interest groups and coalitions that enabled a law like this to be viable, when we do that, we see that the investor-owned utilities were strongly supportive of this law. And I'm happy in the discussion to get more into the details of why this was, but basically they calculated it would generate significant profits for their shareholders by allowing them to sell off some of their existing renewable generation assets at an all-time high price, and then benefiting from significant tax credits for building new renewable generation without being penalized for being slow to get rid of their older fossil fuel generation. I do want to mention that the Inflation Reduction Act did arguably have fewer cost shifts than those state level laws we were just talking about, because it also has a number of excellent consumer facing provisions. So I, for one, am very happy that this law passed, but I would only note that it did so only because investor owned utilities were supportive for financially self-interested reasons. And ultimately, in terms of the sheer dollars, they're much larger beneficiary, the utilities are, than individual consumers, especially lower income consumers. All right, so this is the last example. One of the very exciting things that's been happening in the United States over the past decade or so, led by a few states in particular, is the large uptick in homeowners that are putting solar panels on their roofs to generate their own clean electricity. You can see here the numbers both of solar panel peak capacity that was shipped to US households on the left, as well as which states are most driving this growth on the right. And you can see that California, perhaps unsurprisingly, is leading the way. But how are investor-owned utilities allowing this to happen? How are these net metering laws that have facilitated this growth and chipped away at these utility monopolies been politically viable despite the opposition of these extremely powerful corporate actors? Well, the answer is that regulators and state public utility commissions have agreed to cost shift a lot of utilities revenue to other customers who don't have solar panels. And guess who will never have the ability to have solar panels? Well, people who rent. Landlords have very little incentive to bear the upfront solar installation costs when they're not the ones paying the electricity bill, the renters are. Interestingly, in California, this has resulted in some very strange bedfellows, or maybe a better way to say it is the co-optation of environmental justice groups by investor-owned utilities who have set up an AstroTurf organization called Affordable Clean Energy for All, comprised of the very same groups who are often fighting economic inequality. And so the point is, the reason that utilities have been able to co-opt some of these grassroots groups is because the cost shifting is true. It is a reality that increasing residential solar panels results in cost shifting for everyone else. Of course, it's the utilities who lobbied for that to occur in the first place. So obviously I've covered a lot here, and we've only scratched the surface of some of these very technical and complicated issues, and I'm happy to go deeper on anything in the discussion. But just to respect my time and the other great co-panelists, I'm just going to sort of summarize some big takeaways from a problem-solving perspective, although I'm sure Monica will push me to be even more problem-solving in my prescriptions, which I very much welcome. So one big problem-solving takeaway is that, at least from my vantage point with my US focus, we can't really talk about solving climate change without also talking about who's paying the short-term costs for these longer-term solutions. And I think part of solving climate change equitably through public policy necessitates decentralizing and deprivatizing, or basically democratizing, our electricity system. We're starting to see some very early signs that this may be happening in some places in the country, but we sure have a long way to go. And if we can't pull it off in time, given that the clock is running out in terms of keeping global atmospheric temperatures down, then we'll need to think about how much cost shifting we're actually willing to accept in the name of decarbonization. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Fantastic talk as always. Next, we will move to Daniel Driscoll, who is a postdoctoral scholar at Brown University.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you, Josh, for a fascinating presentation. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. So my name is Dan, and I'm a postdoc at Brown University, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here and honored to be a part of this panel. For me, problem-solving sociology is one of the most exciting things happening in the discipline right now, and it's a great moment for it to talk about climate change. So today I'll be presenting an idea that the format of this panel gave me. So it's very fresh, it's unvetted by anyone actually, and I would love any reactions or feedback. So here's a general outline. I'll begin with a discussion of the time constraint to solve climate change and what scenarios that forces us to consider. I'm going to split them into 3 ideal typical scenarios. There'll be a future with carbon, a future with degrowth, or a future with critical minerals and their extraction. I'll then discuss how our future reality is far from these ideal types and is more based in perhaps a chaotic combination of these 3 scenarios. And then in the end, drawing inspiration from problem-solving sociology, I'll evaluate the 3 scenarios and their respective trade-offs through a sociological theory of change, in this case, the political process model with origins in social movement theory. And I'll argue that this allows researchers and perhaps policymakers to move forward with a bit more coherence and pragmatism. So to begin, I'm not surprising anyone here when I say that there's little time to decarbonize before the world feels serious repercussions from climate change. We have about 8 years to reduce emissions by 43% to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius maximum. And at the same time, 80% of global energy still comes from fossil fuels. So that's about 8 years to spend the trillions we need per annum during a poly crisis, which includes a pandemic, a war, inflation, and a possible recession. And there are generally 3 scenarios that researchers suggest for approaching climate change. And in my view, solving climate change requires a coherent discussion of these paths, their trade-offs and challenges. And currently, there's really a great deal of noise and incoherence in this area. So let's begin with carbon. There are undeniable benefits to continuing to burn carbon. The world economy co-evolved with fossil fuels, so much so that GDP growth is generally associated with carbon emissions. The figure here shows the parallel between GDP per capita growth and carbon emissions over time in the United States. Fossil fuels powered the Industrial Revolution through the post-World War II boom. Fossil fuels are integral to the functioning of capitalism because tapping them just gave us unprecedented amounts of energy. And with that growth comes with a lot of perks. Increased growth means increased levels of public insurance and healthcare programs, increased educational outcomes, increased public desires for fairness and equality, freedom and safety, higher life expectancies, more levels of democracy, and more support for climate action and movements. So emitting carbon, if it's correlated with growth, does come with some benefits. But wow, we know that there are huge costs to continuing down this path. Perhaps the heaviest long-term costs of the 3 scenarios that I lay out. Warming will not only cause systemic global climate impacts that disrupt everyday life, but it'll also lead to huge economic losses, some as large as 18% of GDP in some countries near the equator. And so continuing down this path continues to exploit nature, and it also invests in a finite source of energy. And so many people see these graphs of emissions and GDP like the one I displayed earlier, and as a result, they argue for degrowth. And it's very, very rational. Emissions are correlated with growth in most contexts, especially if much of the energy in that country comes from fossil fuels. And there really is no evidence that in 8 years we can truly decouple fossil fuels from GDP in every country. Now, there's a lot of variation between degrowth proposals, and there's a lot of variation in the sort of quality of these proposals. But most of them involve a redistribution of wealth and an expansion of public goods coupled with an economic recession. In my view, and the view of many others, there are real challenges to the success of degrowth. First, it does ignore economic and historical realities. Progressive reforms and prosperity are linked to growth, which is why in recessions, life tends to get worse for everyone, especially those at the margins of society. Recessions increase poverty. Now, degrowthers might remind me that this could be prevented with redistribution, but economic reality tells us that redistributing wealth would also increase household consumption, and that would increase GDP. So then degrowth is really just growth with redistribution, which is also a great thing. So the question is, can we really solve climate change and redistribution simultaneously? I'm not sure if that's possible in 8 years. And perhaps most damning, degrowthers have no global governance strategy. And in my view, it would probably have to involve some sort of global Stalinist regime. And so as a result, from what I see, the theory really remains confined to elite left circles. And let me add, I don't think there's anything wrong with degrowth, and I'm a leftist. I'm interested in talking about post-capitalism, but I don't see any coherence or good arguments in the movement, and I'd like it to be better. So just to give you an idea of degrowth success, I looked at this data recently. People Google how to get rich more than they Google degrowth, and that just sort of exposes the values of this world right now. Again, I just want to see more pragmatic evidence from this movement and ideas of post-capitalism. My bias is coming through very strongly right now, but I'm just laying out some of the cons of degrowth. Now, the third scenario, which is the one I favor, to give a spoiler, involves decoupling growth from fossil fuels and coupling it to the critical minerals required for electric vehicles, solar panels, and wind turbines. Specifically, this is lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, graphite, rare earth elements, and copper and aluminum, which those two are a little less rare than the others. And the good news with this is energy is not finite like it is from fossil fuels. It doesn't emit carbon, and it's completely renewable. Still, like fossil fuels, getting critical minerals involves extraction. Global demand for these minerals is reaching such heights that mining has been exploitative of labor and environmental safety. Some mines, such as those in the Democratic Republic of Congo, have used forced child labor, and others are completely erasing ecosystems. And capitalists from the global North and East Asia are quickly battling for control over these commodity supply chains around the world. And so the question is, are we really just moving from one way to exploit the planet to another? So here's a brief summary of those three scenarios that I talked about. It's very simple, just 2 pros and 2 cons each. Of course, reality is far more complex. And as I said earlier, our future will likely be a sort of messy combination of these 3 scenarios. And if we really want to evaluate them, like I spoke about earlier, I think sociological theory is useful. And I talked about using political opportunity theory. And so I thought it'd be fun to sort of run each scenario through the lens of the political process model. And if you're not familiar, in the political process model, movement success is evaluated by 3 things. The first is organizational strength. That's perhaps the size of the organization, its funds, its political clout, as well as the consciousness of the public. This could be public opinion on said issue. And then finally, their political opportunities for the movement. Recessions generally can stall political opportunities, especially if they're progressive. War shifts priorities, as we're seeing right now. Political majorities can constrain choices, and so on. So let's examine each scenario. And this is, again, very simplified and early on. So to start, the Carbon Coalition has a lot of organizational strength behind it. There's lots of sunk capital in fossil fuel development, and they have a lot of political power and access, especially here in the US. This is why the recent IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, also dumped money into fossil fuels, not just renewables. Regarding consciousness around carbon, public opinion seems to be shifting away from fossil fuels and toward renewables. Furthermore, it seems like markets are also beginning to realize that fossil fuels are poor investments and they're finite. So I do think their political opportunities are mixed despite their sort of historic power. Degrowth I've been over. I really think it's weak in every domain. And then finally, the organization of critical mineral coalitions are strengthening. There's no doubt now that the world is moving in this direction. There are more and more political opportunities, and public opinion is generally supportive of their expansion. So stepping back, it really seems like doubling down on carbon or critical minerals, or a combination of the two, seem like the most likely scenarios in the future. So now if we sort of break these down, burning all the carbon left on the planet is clearly the worst decision long-term because the energy is finite and we're cooking the planet. So I think we can eliminate it. Degrowth at the moment is not very realistic or coherent. So to me, this means that we can actually prioritize our focus and we can solve the negatives associated with using critical minerals. For this, there need to be strong regulations in trade, which international organizations can oversee. The IMF, for instance, was actually a very radical institution until the 1980s when it began to police the economies of periphery countries. Its founding was actually very radical. And so we need to regulate labor and environmental safety and neocolonial capitalist exploitations of countries in the global south. Some countries like Indonesia are shifting their developmental strategies, and they've nationalized their critical mineral industries. And so we might have a future where instead of petrostates, we have electrostates, right? It's interesting to consider. So to wind down, I do think this presentation and the conclusion I've come to on the surface is very obvious, but I think the logic and process of arriving there is often ignored. We have limited time, which means we actually need coherence and we need to prioritize our solutions and policy choices. And currently, I think there's a lot of incoherence, even among leftists and academics. And so there's something to be said for laying these choices out as ideal types, weighing trade-offs, and then evaluating them with a sociological theory that's powerful for thinking about change and political success. I don't think many would conclude that we need to prioritize our energy towards solving the negatives of critical mineral extraction. And so once we really work on sort of labor and environmental regulations and developmental strategies for countries on the periphery who have these commodities, then I think we can actually talk about post-capitalism and degrowth, but I don't think it's possible in the next 8 years. Thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to any reactions.
Thank you, Daniel. I think everyone agrees with me. This is just a fabulous talk and two fabulous talks so far. Next, we are going to move to David PELLOW, who is the chair of the Department of Environmental Studies and director of the Global Environmental Justice Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. It's wonderful to be on this panel. And really appreciate the presentations, fabulous presentations that Josh and Daniel just gave. I'm going to offer some thoughts that are very, very local and far more direct and less theoretical in terms of solving the climate change crisis. So I bring you greetings from unceded indigenous traditional lands and territories of the Chumash folks, also known as Santa Barbara County, California, where in the past few years, we were awarded a Mellon Sawyer seminar on energy justice in a global perspective. And this was a multidisciplinary group of faculty and students with these guiding questions. How are frontline communities being disproportionately affected by the entrenched energy regimes, and how are they being ignored in these policy debates? And how can we, as faculty and students, work with these communities on the front lines to address these problems of ecological and social inequities? And so this was a collaborative effort from the very beginning, with courses, with seminars, with public-facing events, but also focused on action. So we had scholars, we had artists and community leaders coming together to try to create solutions to the climate crisis, to the energy crisis. And our core conviction is that frontline or fence line communities, those who are most disproportionately impacted, have the solutions or have insights into those solutions that can guide our action forward. So my course that I did in the spring of 2019 was focused on participation and collaboration. Again, this was funded by the Mellon Foundation, and many of you no doubt are familiar with those Mellon Sawyer seminars. They're really wonderful. And I really co-led two classes. One was a grad seminar, the other was an undergraduate class, and we combined them at times for collaborative action. And we basically did a series of speed dating exercises where we matched students with leaders and organizations from what is called the Central Coast Climate Justice Network. And we did 4 projects. I'm going to talk about 2 of them here. The first is the Cat Canyon oil drilling proposal. This was something where 3 major fossil fuel corporations came together in Northern California, Northern Santa Barbara County's Cat Canyon, and wanted to drill some 800 oil wells. Clearly, this would affect our climate, it would affect our water systems, it would affect our flora and fauna, and none of us were in favor of this. So students using basic social science research methods and techniques and common sense actually dug in to the real impacts that this projects would have, and did an analysis of the environmental impact statements and reports, and found that there was far more CO2 equivalents that were going to be released on an annual basis than had been estimated in the environmental impact reports. In fact, over 40 years, it would be the equivalent of having 6.6 million cars on the streets of California. And that's saying a lot, given that we are addicted to automobiles out here. But it also had a laser light focus on the greediness, the hydro thirst of this industry as well. And students found definitively and conclusively that these three oil companies would actually use far more water in their operations for well drilling, well cleaning out, completion, substitution wells, dust abatement, you name it, than had previously been estimated and disclosed. So what we were doing was working with a regional coalition of activist groups who were doing their best. They were hell-bent on preventing these 760, almost 800 wells from being drilled, and we succeeded. This was 2 years ago. The last of the three oil corporations withdrew. A major victory for climate sustainability, climate justice, environmental justice, and we were pleased with ourselves. We played a small role in that. The second project was focused on Ventura County, which is just south of Santa Barbara County, where I am, where recently the U.S. Geological Survey discovered hydrocarbons in the water that is actually feeding into the agricultural system, that is actually being used to irrigate crops. I don't care how conservative you are, I'm pretty sure very few of us would be okay with drinking or eating oil. So this was a major issue. A federal agency said so, and there was a moratorium on oil and gas well drilling in parts of Ventura County where these hydrocarbons were discovered. Our students fanned out, worked with groups like Food and Water Action, the Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy, and others, to get the public word out to try to make that moratorium permanent. And so they wrote op-eds like this one here in the Ventura County Reporter. They fanned out and went to bodegas and mercados and places like Whole Foods to reach people who are Spanish speaking, who are English speaking, to bring them out to the County Board of Supervisors hearings. They produced flyers in both Spanish and English to get folks out to this June 2019 hearing. And we mobilized enough people, enough public sentiment and support, and we won another victory, preventing more oil and gas drilling in the Central Coast region. The Central Coast region of California, by the way, is immediately north of California. It's basically the biggest region between LA, sorry, I said north of California, north of LA, and south of the Bay Area. So we're called the Central Coast. And the second project I want to talk about really morphed out of the first. And so these activist groups who were working with us to successfully get oil to stay in the ground was called the Central Coast Climate Justice Network. And as you can see here, it's a collaboration of some 20 some odd organizations that are social justice, immigrant rights, indigenous justice, mainstream environmental organizations, climate justice, and environmental justice groups who came together with a two-pronged strategy. The first was, we need to address this issue of a just transition, right? We need to move toward a post-fossil fuel economy, but we're never going to do that if we aren't centering equity and social and racial justice. So baked in to the work that we do is a focus on justice and an understanding that there is no climate sustainability without social justice and equity. And so our vision is to create a more resilient and just region in the face of climate change by leading our just transition away from fossil fuels while transforming current social, economic, and environmental systems and conditions. And so the first thing we decided to do was to build a platform, a policy framework, just like AOC, Markey, and many other people around this country have done around a Green New Deal. And we decided to bring together old-fashioned methods of social science using focus groups, along with house meetings, which, as you can see in this picture with Cesar Chavez and some other folks, this was something that was also developed by the United Farm Workers in their movement to get justice in the face of abuse and exploitation by growers in the agricultural sector. These are small gatherings in people's homes. Many folks are intimidated by town halls and government-sponsored hearings. They're not intimidated by meeting with friends and colleagues and coworkers and residents and neighbors in their own homes, in the neighborhood. We provide food, we provide childcare. We've had some 35 meetings across the county of Santa Barbara and continue to do so in Ventura County. And we're asking people simple questions. What would you like to see in a Green New Deal? What would you like to see more of in your community? What would you like to see less of? What would be your vision of a sustainable and equitable society and community? And so this is just a sampling of the broad swath of humanity that we've been able to reach and have vigorous participation from in these House meetings and focus groups. And we got some 135 policy proposals, recommendations from literally about 400, 450 conversations we've had with folks. And so we've categorized those into three rather large and unwieldy policy buckets that we are now trying to move forward on: infrastructure and economy, social justice, and democracy. And so to break each of those down very briefly, within infrastructure and economy, there's a broad focus on transportation, energy, housing, and a just transition. Again, the just transition, that idea that as we move from a fossil fuel to a post-fossil fuel economy, we don't want to leave anybody behind, particularly folks whose livelihoods are directly connected to the fossil fuel industry. So you can see from these policy proposals, they're quite broad. One of my favorites is down here, these last two bullet points, very creative ideas that have come from other places around the world, where because we have had so many disasters associated with drought and climate change, climate injustice, debris flows, and the rest, here in California, people are saying, you know what, that's horrible, but that's also an economic opportunity. Let's align job creation with disaster planning to create a more climate resilient infrastructure. Under the big bucket of social justice, we had, not surprisingly, focusing on defunding the police, focusing on reparations for Indigenous communities, focusing on expanding mental health and wellness services, making our county a sanctuary county, and expunging the criminal records of those who were formerly incarcerated, creating pathways to entrepreneurialism and employment in key sectors like renewable energy and cannabis. Last but not least, as has become very clear around the world as we see the rise of fascism in the GOP and in other nations, we need democracy. The empirical research is quite crystal clear here that those cities, those counties, those states, those nations that have stronger indicators of democratization are much more likely to be protective of their climate and the environment. And this was a resounding message that we got from folks in these House meetings and focus groups. And so several of the meetings that we had, including our own very town hall, were held in multiple languages: English, Spanish, and two dialects of the indigenous Mixteco language. And so, I'll end with this. This is our Facebook site there and our website, and I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, David. It is so incredible to hear about actual success stories. So next we're going to turn to RAKA SEN. RAKA is a grad student in sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, and she's also going to talk to us about overlooked communities.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Yes, I'm RAKA SEN. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania in sociology, and I'm just going to hop right in. So discussions of climate change response have long been categorized by ideas of adaptation and mitigation. And while I believe that mitigation efforts are tremendously important, today I'm going to focus on thinking with all of you about climate change adaptation. So as climate changes, adaptation is changing from an idea about how to deal with climate change to something that is reshaping daily social and economic realities across the globe. And as this is a problem-solving workshop, I'm going to quickly highlight the smaller problem within the umbrella of solving climate change, which is so big, ambitious, and important that I want us to think about today. So climate change adaptation decisions are made mainly by global professional experts, while local vulnerable communities have limited input and live within the constraints of these decisions. On top of that, experts from, quote, developed nations dominate global climate discussions, further drowning out the voices of the vulnerable people. And as a result, climate vulnerable communities are systematically dispossessed and displaced, resulting from imposed top-down projects that reify capitalist values. And this thinking renders what people are doing and how they're adapting in the everyday invisible. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the IPCC definition of adaptation is not limited to the level of planning and policy, but in practice, the term adaptation is predominantly used to refer to planned interventions, for example, hardening shorelines, raising roads and bridges, and planning the relocation of vulnerable structures. Somehow, the idea of what adaptation is has become sedimented in our minds, far away from its actual definition. Hence, today, I'm hoping that we can rethink adaptation together, challenge what it has become, and think about what arises when we do that. I'm hoping more so than a talk today to put forward some ideas that we can brainstorm and think about together. Next slide. So first, to tell you a little bit about my research, hello from Kolkata. I'm sorry if I seem a little sleepy, it's past midnight, but I'm very excited to be here. And I'm currently concluding the end of over a year of ethnographic fieldwork in the Sundarbans region of India and Bangladesh, though I have been visiting this region sporadically for the last 5 years as well. And I've seen it through 4 big cyclones and now the aftermath of the pandemic. So really been here for some big changes. Next slide. Okay, so as we know, the relationship between humans and the changing climate is layered and complex. The Sundarbans are often referred to as climate change ground zero, meaning it's where climate change is happening right now. Not to say that it's not also happening in other places. But this map that you're seeing here is Climate Central's projections of where water levels will be based on sea level rise by 2050. And what's kind of crazy about this map is this is just like on a regular day, and during monsoon season, about 30% more of this region will flood. So just imagine what a monsoon season in this region will look like in 2050, which is not that far away. But there is only so much that looking at something from a bird's eye view can tell you. So next slide. Zooming in on the people who live there, on the one hand, they're directly experiencing environmental harms such as salinity intrusion, coastal erosion, increased storms, higher and hungrier tides, irregular seasons, and more frequent embankment breakages. But they're also experiencing a parallel intrusion of development and governance structures coming in to help them with the effects of climate change, or equally as often using the concept of climate change as a guise for projects and agendas that have long been underway. This later phenomenon is really well marked in the literature, and for more about it, I highly recommend Camelia Diwan's new book and Danielle Falzon's work. Next slide. In my work, I focus on salinity intrusion. I use it as a case of the complicated interlinkages between climate change and development on daily life. I argue that there's 3 interlinked processes of increases and accumulations of salt. First, naturally occurring. Second, exacerbated by capitalist development. And third, exacerbated by anthropogenic climate change. It's impossible to make a claim that everyday individual behaviors are connected to climate change because the pathway between them is complicated by so many other variables. And that's where this is where one of my critiques of what we call adaptation is, because we often make this claim. I try to understand what kinds of causal arguments, everyday local understandings allow us to theorize, and how these theorizations help us broaden our understanding of climate change adaptation beyond neoliberal development paradigms. Next slide. To think about this, Brianna Castro from Harvard Sociology and I came up with this idea of what we call everyday adaptation. So everyday adaptation is a method of attuning to the hyper-local changes that are being made by people experiencing a wide array of environmental harms and how these changes aggregate. From what I have seen, everyday adaptations of local people paint a very different picture than the ones put forth by many global experts of climate change and development. We often read stories painted of people in vulnerable communities of just really dismal lives, but their lives are both dismal in some ways and also not in some ways. Accounts of everyday life instead elucidate how socio-environmental inequalities are lived in. As Rebecca Elliott's 2018 paper shows us, the change in climate is, however, experienced as tremendous material loss. In the case of salinity intrusion in the Sundarbans, these losses can range from loss of peace, loss of traditional fish and crops, all the way to the ability to bear children. The confluence of climate change and development in this region is rewriting the social context and norms. Next slide. In the Sundarbans, people's lives are constricted both by a worsening climate and also mounting labor requirements in various forms. I conceptualize the climate-linked changes in their life through the lens of work, or what I call adaptation labor. So this includes new or modified work that takes place due to ecological changes, including paid and unpaid labor practices. Ultimately, this is one example of an everyday adaptation to climate breakdown. Due to the loss of agricultural lands from the hardening of coastlines and concrete embankments that keep the land salty, residents of the Sundarbans have lost many traditional forms of work, such as fishing and agriculture. In large part, this work has been replaced by the shrimp and crab aquaculture, an industry known for creating, maintaining, and profiting from the salinity intrusion that torments people's lives in the region. This is also well marked in the literature through Adnan's work, Kohadakarda, Paproti, and Gons. These industries have permeated the development complex and promoted their harmful industry as a way of bringing quote unquote sustainable livelihoods to a climate-stricken place. Instead, these projects use the Sundarbans residents as for cheap labor for massive capitalist projects and simultaneously exacerbate the salinity intrusions in the region. The work of coping with their salty lives is an example of what I call adaptation labor. And continuing adaptations like these quote unquote sustainable livelihoods is obviously not how to solve climate change. Next slide. So this brings us to where we can talk about solutions. What comes to mind for me directly is how we can use these bottom-up frameworks to first understand adaptation labor and then help reduce it. I'm excited to hear from all of you, but one of the ideas that I think about a lot as a scholar is putting forth these ideas of different scales of adaptation paired with calls for development policy to align these scales and better understand the needs of those who are actually adapting to climate change. For instance, interrupting the sustainable livelihood conversation. Obviously, we know there are huge problems with development, like I just highlighted, but I think what is not said enough is that not all development is bad, especially in regions like this. For instance, while building embankments and hardening coastlines all over the Sundarbans and surrounding region has created tremendous problems, new electric and road infrastructures have made the region far more livable than ever before in some ways. While it's not ideal, but what we saw in Daniel's talk is time is of the essence, and these are existing infrastructures that could be repurposed. So thinking in that vein, I wonder how we can build on the good of development that's happening in the region and reduce the bad. Next slide. So that gets us to thinking, how does rethinking adaptation help us solve climate change? I think that what this helps all of us do is reorient the conversation away from neoliberal hegemonic thought that got us here in the first place. Adaptation to climate change has become such a vague and muddled idea, in part because oftentimes wealthier nations are footing the bill for nations hardest hit by climate change to quote adapt, but really the money is to assuage their guilt about their own country's consumption patterns and emissions. It ends up being implemented in ways that reify the way that these wealthy countries think. And for these countries, reducing consumption and emissions is inarguably necessary. It also allows us to take a step back and say things like, hey, wait, that's not adaptation to climate change, it's just a development project. Or in the shrimp of the crab and shrimp aquaculture, hey, wait, that's just capitalist extraction. What I think is really cool about recentering adaptation conversation is that it opens up a list of possibilities for actual adaptations. A lot of which for me are comparable to the Green New Deal ideologies that exist in the US, because this is where I live also. So for instance, many people in the Sundarbans, while they don't plan to move away from home, they're having their kids and families shift closer to cities while they stay back in the Sundarbans. And when kids go alone to cities, they're shifted into collective homes where they live together and take care of each other. So I think there's a major opportunity there to build these homes into more beautiful and livable places. Another thing, next slide, sorry. Another thing that's really striking, a really striking change is that people are working outside of their village a lot of the time. And this has created a larger gap between people living in the Sundarbans because there's more outside income coming in. So some people have really beautiful 2 or 3 story concrete homes, while others have small handmade clay homes. But no matter what sort of upward mobility you have experienced, there's still one major problem, which is access to clean water. And water for these villages is often comes through what's pictured here. It's called a time call, and it needs to be collected daily or sometimes twice daily. And people describe the water that comes through as a little bit salty, a little bit red, meaning that they can taste the dirt in it, minerally, or like needing time to settle. And even if you have money, buying bottled water isn't always an option because it can be pretty irregular to access. The time costs have also kind of become cool social hotspots where a lot of the social and political life of people of the Sundarbans happens. People do everything from gardening support for upcoming elections, making eyes at cute potential romantic partners, showing off their new saris, sharing the latest gossip, and checking in with one another in these spaces. This is a place like roads and electricity where I think development might actually be able to do something good. Something like creating on the spot water filtration systems come to mind. But what would be even cooler is if we could envision fountains or some sort of water feature that makes it so more than one person can access the water at a time, while also embracing the already public natures of these spaces. Next slide. So that was all that I was thinking about, and I'm excited to chat more in the Q&A.
Thank you, Raka. That is so fascinating and brings an entire new dimension into what we've been discussing. And now we turn to another area of the world, GABRIEL SUCHODOLSKI, who is a graduate student at the University of California at Los Angeles.
Hi, thanks everyone for being here, and thank you so much, Monica, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be part of this discussion. And what I'm going to talk about has many resonances with what the wonderful previous presentations talked about. And specifically, I'll talk about how rural elites promote Amazonian deforestation and how redistributive policies can help to curb deforestation. This is a side project from data that I've accumulated doing ethnographic work in the Amazon for the past 10 years now. And this is the first time I presented this way. So it'll be, I'm happy to get any feedback and comments. So Amazonia is one of the top global climate tipping points. It regulates temperature of the atmosphere, and it serves as a sort of air conditioning of the planet, not so much as the lungs of the planet as used to be thought of. It's not a big net producer of oxygen, but it does cool down air quite a bit through its tree canopies, which also produce so-called flying rivers, large flows of humongous quantities of water that then feed into the rest of South America and occasionally even Northern Africa. Of the top 5 global tipping points of the planet, Amazonia is the only one that has been long and extensively inhabited. And so it is the only one directly amenable to human action. And human action has been in the past few decades one of deforestation. And deforestation ceases this air conditioning service that it provides. It curtails the flying rivers effect, and it has turned the Amazon into a net carbon emitter for the past 7 years, as opposed to a carbon capture. And this is produced mostly by deforestation and pastures, cattle ranching specifically. So the Amazon possesses, Brazil possesses about 60% of the Amazon forest, and these areas in yellow here that you can see are the accumulated deforested areas of the past 7 decades. Deforestation began with these colonization processes of road building and settlement creation. And it was part of a geopolitical plan to occupy the Amazon by the Brazilian state. But this kind of gave way to this uncontrolled land frontier with land grabs, ranching, alluvial gold mining, and logging that amount to a great enclosure of the production of private property over this large area. And so deforestation exploded in the 1970s and 80s through this uncontrolled land frontier. we have pretty good data of deforestation rates yearly from 1998 until today. And you can see a lot of deforestation. High rates remain throughout the 90s until 2004, when the Brazilian government, then under Lula, put in strong policies to curb deforestation, and it was very successful at that. It diminished by 80% until 2012, when the growth of deforestation resumed and kind of exploded during Bolsonaro's government from 2019 onwards, with 25–30% growth rates annually. And 2012 isn't compiled here, but it will be much greater than 2021 by many estimates. So I'm going to talk here about, try to make a comparison between this moment of curbing deforestation until 2013, then sort of understand the mechanisms of what happened from 2013 until today, and what could be put in place. And my title gives it away: redistributive policies to really make deforestation, to curb it strongly and permanently. So what happened to curb deforestation from 2004 to 2012 was sustainable development and social environmental policies that had lots of civil society and social movement input. And effectively, they closed the land frontier by creating lots of protected areas, indigenous lands, conservation units, community-held areas that amounted to 48% of the Amazonian territory. Also, a very important part of this was strengthening institutions of command and control that go into deforestation hotspots and arrest people, embargo areas, give high environmental fines, and so forth. And so they physically impede deforestation. This was put in place 2004 and then again re-strengthened 2011. But in addition to this commonly told stories are less known stories of provisioning of welfare to local populations, which meant income and a little bit of public services. And also that came together with the stronger urbanization of the region, and very importantly, wage increases that meant alternative income opportunities. So all of this produced an 80% decline in deforestation rates in this period. But then we have the resumption of deforestation growth from 2013 until today. And that has been produced also importantly by policy changes that were caused by a ruralista, like large landowners caucus in Congress that implemented legal changes, but also sub-federal political opposition to environmental policies. And locally, the eventual lack of income substitutes for predatory industries, such as cutting the forest itself, having pastures, raising cattle, and so forth. So this led to a rise in deforestation from 2013, and this exploded after 2019. Under Bolsonaro, the government clearly promoted the deregulation and the infra-legal dismantling of the policies that helped to curb deforestation and of the institutions that implemented it. Additionally, the government promoted an attack on civil society organizations that combated deforestation, and specifically environmental NGOs, as well as civil servants that worked in these institutions. So deforestation rates clearly map into a pattern of policy here, of policies meant to curb it, and then policies that help to make it rise again. But what I want to focus on is local social processes that actually on the ground undertake deforestation. And in some, this process was resuming deforestation, I think had a lot to do with not only these policy changes, but a sort of weak lingering social environmentalism that was never fully implemented up until in the era of curbing deforestation. And so local populations felt environmentalist policies as punitive, unfair. It would be local poor people getting arrested, not their bosses, not the owners of these large ranches, not the corporations that finance and gave credit for soy and et cetera, et cetera. So the whole environmentalist apparatus was largely seen as unfair, cowardly, and highly disruptive of their income possibilities, of local people's income possibilities. And they had no alternative income other than small welfare and wage opportunities. While they were being kept, lots of local were being kept from predatory industries, they saw these predatory industries rise and produce lots of income in their surrounding areas, undertaken by elites who were more or less protected from these environmentalist policies. And so there was still this dynamic of an open frontier economy and precarious local conditions for local populations. And in this context, rural elites were able to employ local people, co-opt them, and coerce sometimes local populations into predatory activities. And this produced deforestation, opposition to environmentalism, and eventually support for Bolsonaro, which, by the way, increased in this region between the last election and 2018 and 2022. So how do rural elites promote deforestation? First, directly. They hire and coordinate deforestation labor. Now, to deforest an area about the size that you see in this picture costs about $300,000. It's really not cheap, and it's not at all available to local people to do this, at least at a fast pace, and not get caught by the environmental police. So companies and groups who undertake this have lots of capital. They employ laborers, and they have a high profit rate. Whatever area they buy, they can sell for 10 times more once they deforest and plant pastures over it, sometimes with airplanes dropping seeds. So it is a high capital intensive activity, but it is also permeable to smaller entrepreneurs who can make a lot of money brokering land deals and brokering work groups too. And so there's this booming cattle and grains economy that boosts this type of advancement into the forest of land deals, creating pasture, raising cattle, and it's become pervasive, and several municipalities live off of these activities. So rural elites also deforest in an indirect way by creating a political machine of deforestation that dominates several of these municipalities, if not most of them in the Amazon. And so they elect politicians who favor predatory economies. They're most often than not members of the predatory elites themselves, big cattle ranchers, big gold mine owners. They oftentimes are the mayors of these little towns. They infiltrate networks within the state to subvert environmental policies, to rattle whenever there's going to be a police operation. And they also lead popular contentious action against social environmental actions. So for instance, in this picture, you see an old burned down office of an environmental agency that was burnt down with the participation of the local mayor. in 2017, and it was never rebuilt. I took this picture recently. And so by expanding these activities, undermining environmental policies, they also swamp out small producers, and they preempt social environmental leadership. They coerce leaders who try to do differently, who try to undertake social environmental activities and alternative productions. So how redistributive policies can curb deforestation? Well, besides the governance shock that is much required, I argue for a broad redistribution that can prevent rural elite reaction by providing immediate income opportunities for local populations, really strong in bioeconomy, of revamped forest extractivism with lots of research and indigenous local knowledge input, and environmental services and carbon credit that are focused on the end user, differently from what happens now, which lots of the profit stays with the licensing and brokerage institutions. And the need for institutionalized public services to help curb the clientelistic power of rural elites. And last but not least, strengthening local civil society. I guess I'm over time, so I'll wrap that up and happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. Another fascinating talk. Please join me in thanking all of the panelists. I think I learned more in the last hour than I have learned in several years of thinking about climate change. So thank you to everyone. And we have about 25 minutes now for questions. So if you would like to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand and I'll get a queue started. And